Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carol Davit, and you are tuned in to our webinar called A Proposed State Statute, Ceasing the Sale of Invasive Plants. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and I'm Chair of the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force. And joining me is Matt Arndt, who is owner of Matt's Healthy Woods and Wildlife, and he's Vice Chair of the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force. I'm going to present some slides, and then we'll have a question and answer period, and Matt and I will both be available to address your questions. You can also post questions into the chat, and Felicia Brundick, who is the Missouri Prairie Foundation Outreach and Education Coordinator, she will do her best to answer them if, for example, if you're looking for a web link or have a clarifying question. But if she cannot answer your questions, then we will address them at the end. So thanks so much for joining us. So as I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. We're a conservation organization, 54 years old, and a land trust. We own and manage original unplowed prairie. We also run the Grow Native program, and then through Grow Native, the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force. The Grow Native program is our 20-year-old native plant marketing and education program that serves the lower Midwest. And our goals are to increase the demand for and supply of native plants for their effective use in developed landscapes. So we're interested in native plants, and by extension, we're also interested in the impacts of invasive plants. And it's because of this reason that we created the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force, also known as MoIP for short. And the task force was created in 2015. It fills a need in Missouri for an interdisciplinary, multi-agency, multi-organization invasive plant task force that many other states have and have had in place for some time, even prior to 2015. And we review, discuss, and recommend action related to managing known and potential invasive plant species that negatively impact working land-based economies, natural communities, and built landscapes in Missouri. And we're also paying attention to what's happening in states around Missouri because, of course, invasive plants don't pay attention to state boundaries. And in the photo, this is a photo of a number of the members of our task force. We have two tiers of engagement with our task force. We have members who regularly participate in quarterly meetings. This year, of course, they were virtual. But the organizations and agencies that you see here listed are represented with members on our task force. And then our second tier of engagement are stakeholders. These are professionals representing the organizations and groups that you see here who do not regularly attend meetings, but they help disseminate our information, provide us with feedback. And before we launch too far into this, I want to just share some definitions with you that MoIP uses. So when we talk about native, we mean plants native plants that originally occur within a region as the result of natural processes and are adapted to local climate and soils. Native plants have co-evolved with native insects and wildlife and are critical to ecosystem functions. And for MoIP's purposes, native plants are those species that were present prior to widespread European settlement. By non-native, we mean plants that are introduced intentionally or accidentally to a new place or new type of habitat. And historically, most of these introductions have resulted from human activities. Since they did not evolve locally over thousands of years, their presence can often have negative impacts on endemic ecosystems. And you may have heard the words exotic, alien, and introduced, which are synonyms for non-native. It's important to note that not all non-native plants are invasive, and these are generally not the focus of MoIP's attention. The term aggressive is used often, our definition is plants that usually because of human-caused disturbances spread rapidly, can outcompete other plant species. Aggressive plants can be native or non-native, and they may be aggressive in some situations, but not others. And then finally, invasive. Our definition, which is modified from invasive.org, is an invasive plant species is an aggressive, non-native species whose presence causes or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. And these species grow and reproduce rapidly. And we are most concerned with invasive plants because of their direct negative impacts. Just a bit of background on invasive species. They're considered the second greatest threat to native species and ecosystems worldwide, and they threaten working land-based economies. Infestations are generally linked to human movements and markets and consumer preference for certain goods. They can cost hundreds of billions of dollars annually nationwide to control and through lost productivity. And in Missouri, there are landowners who spend $10,000, $100,000 of their own funds controlling invasive plants. And to give you another just small example, last year, 15% of the Missouri Department of Conservation's Landowner and Community Assistance Program budget went to invasive control. And of course, there are federal cost share programs that provide taxpayer-funded cost share programs for private landowners. So that's a lot of money is spent there as well. And nonprofit groups and municipalities and other groups are spending considerable funds controlling invasive plants. There is considerable research that documents the negative impacts of invasive plants. This article from the Journal of Forestry was a review of scientific literature focused on challenges to forest ecosystems. And you can see here some quotes from this study. Invasive woody plants are profoundly altering the structure and function of forest ecosystems. Woody invaders pose a variety of challenges for forest managers, for natural resource managers. There's research for documenting the impact of invasive plants in grassland systems and other systems as well. And to kind of summarize these negative impacts, invasive plants pose threats to working land-based economies, for example, livestock production, tree farms, forest products. And invasive plants that spread beyond where they're planted can affect neighboring property and potentially the livelihoods of those neighbors and even their potential future land values. Invasive plants pose threats to outdoor recreation industry, can affect hunting, fishing, hiking opportunities, and the funding that's spent in those pursuits. And they also pose threats to land management in urban areas, parks and roadsides. And of course, threats to native biological diversity and native ecosystems. So how are these invasive plants moving around? Well, they're moving around accidentally as contaminants in seed or plant shipments in or on wildlife, livestock, or people, moving by wind or water. They're moving in ships or even truck, tire tread, cars, boats, airplane cargo. They can spread through packing material. For example, dried Japanese stiltgrass was used to pack china dishes, and that's how it spread. They can spread in management equipment in natural communities or farms or roadsides through logging equipment, mowers, tractors, and so forth. They're also moving around intentionally. They have been sold and in some cases are still being sold and planted for erosion control, agricultural uses, wildlife benefits, industrial uses, horticulture uses, and even recently we've seen some promotion of non-native trees for quick cash for timber. So because of these negative impacts, MoIP created a list of priorities when it began in 2015. And our first priority was to create an assessment of plants known to be invasive in Missouri. And this assessment includes 142 plants. They're ranked according to their impact, abundance, and spread, and by region with maps, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We also have a high priority of educating Missouris about the impacts of invasive plants. We want to, and we continue to build on campaigns to raise awareness, stop production, sale, and intentional distribution of invasive plants, and we encourage removal of known invasive plants and provide resources on native plant ID and control. A couple of years ago, for example, we hosted a calorie pair field event in Columbia to help provide information about how rapidly this tree can spread. Some other projects, we have an invasive plant action award program to help recognize individuals and groups who are working hard and successfully to control invasive plants. We do outreach to suppliers and buyers of plants for the mainstream horticulture industry to let them know of the invasive nature of some plants that they might be selling. We have many resources available at moinvasives.org. For example, Tina Casagrande, she's an independent contractor who coordinates much of the activities of MoIP, and she created these wonderful posters to help people have choices of planting perhaps native serviceberry or native black gum instead of invasive calorie pear. So we have these wonderful posters and a number of other resources on our website, including Stop the Spread pledge information. A couple of years ago, we developed this pledge to stop the spread of invasive plant species as a way to help entities who had a plan for controlling invasive plants and were actively doing this, so they could signal to their constituents or their neighbors their work and their commitment to controlling invasive plants. And to date, almost 120 landowners, municipalities, and other entities have taken the pledge. And you can find that at our website, moinvasives.org. Last year, we organized a calorie pear buyback event. And this was promoted largely through social media. It reached almost 160,000 people in less than 1 month. And I mention this simply to point out that there is a lot of interest and a lot of concern about invasive plants. This is a photo collage that Tina put together of some of the many people who cut down their calorie pears last year. Cut down the pear, took a picture, brought the picture to a site where they could get a native tree to plant instead of their cut down calorie pear. So we've been engaged in a number of educational activities about invasive plants, but is education enough? And I'll get to that in a moment, but first, I want to discuss for a few minutes how many plants in Missouri are actually invasive. So if we look at the totality of all plants in Missouri, known as the flora of Missouri, we have about 2,800 plant species in Missouri, according to Dr. George Hitzkevich Steiermark's Flora of Missouri book. And according to another publication by Ladd and Thomas, they document 2,961 plant species. And of these, just under 2,000 are native, so just about 70%, and then about 885% or 30% are non-native. And our ranked assessment of invasive plants, which I'll share with you in a moment, lists 142. So the main point here is that not all non-native plants are invasive. So of the almost 3,000 plant species in Missouri, 885 non-native, and of those, we're determining that about 142 have invasive characteristics. So just a bit about our invasive plant assessment. We have an assessment working group that looked at previous lists from Missouri and other states of invasive plants and narrowed that list down to 142 species. There were 26 reviewers, botanists, field biologists, and other professionals who ranked these species according to their impact, their abundance, and trend. And this was 5 years of work. And so the categories of information that we asked reviewers to rank were impact, and by that we mean how severe is the current impact of the species on natural communities in the Missouri division or other region that they were looking at. So these are the categories. Was there a severe ecological impact, for example, bush honeysuckle? A moderate ecological impact, such as multiflora rose? Is there a low impact, such as Deptford pink, which is a very small non-native wildflower that you'll find in almost any grassland? They're present, but they have very minimal impacts. Or is the plant restricted to disturbed or very developed areas, such as chicory, which is a blue flower that you see along roadsides? It's quite common, but it's restricted to those areas. So these are the different categories of impact that those reviewers use to rate those species. We also asked them to look at abundance, and the categories to look at here we define these categories of abundance this way. High would be greater than 1,000 populations, moderate 100 to 1,000 populations, low 10 to 100 populations, trace fewer than 10. And then lastly, trend. We asked reviewers to estimate how rapidly the species range would expand to form new occurrences throughout the Missouri division or region of their expertise over the next 10 years. So they were ranking according, if they thought there was a rapid increase, moderate, gradual, or stable/decreasing. So you can find all of this information on our website on the homepage. Just click on assessment and you will find this list and accompanying maps. You can search, scroll through by scientific name, common name, and there will be maps that go with each. You can use the search bar here. So for example, if you were to put in honeysuckle, you would find this list of species with the accompanying maps. And then here is an example of a Muir maple and the maps that accompany it, and you can see the map of impact, abundance, and trend. Another example, autumn olive, you can see the impact, abundance, and trend of this species. Are we stopping the spread of invasive plants as a state? Well, there are some great examples of excellent control. It does take immense resource investment of labor and money. So there are some great examples, but as a state, I would say no, we are not, because of this immense resource investment, also lack of adequate statewide outreach and education, which is something that we're continually working on, but also because we have ongoing sale and intentional distribution of some known invasive plants. So how do we address the issue of ongoing sale and intentional distribution of these invasive plants? We have a tool at our disposal already in place in Missouri. It's the Missouri Noxious Weed Law. And from the Missouri Department of Agriculture website, I want to share with you what the term noxious specifically means here. The term noxious refers to the weed's ability to cause economic harm to the state's agriculture industry and to the high level of difficulty associated with controlling or eradicating the species. The state of Missouri designates 12 species of weeds as noxious. This law requires property owners to control noxious weeds on their property, and it prohibits noxious weeds from being sold. In violation of either of these provisions is subject to penalty by county prosecutors. Adding a plant to the Missouri Noxious Weed Law list requires review and approval by the Missouri Department of Agriculture. And the Missouri Department of Agriculture has no authority to deal with noxious weed violations. Again, that's up to county prosecutors, but the Department of Agriculture is happy to provide technical assistance to any landowner dealing with a noxious weed problem. What you see on the right is the first page of an article that Tina Casagrande, who coordinates so much of our work, found, published by Bioscience this year, an analysis of US state regulated weed lists, a discordance between biology and policy. On the left, you'll see some facts that Matt Arndt, our vice chair, pulled together from having read this article. And he found that the national average is 75 species on state noxious weed law. So again, Missouri has 12 species. The national average is 75. And you can see some state examples here. This study here shows Missouri with 391 noxious weeds known to occur in the state that are not included on a regulated list. I think this does include row crop species. So this is the fourth most of any state. So again, it just gives you some information, kind of puts our noxious weed law in perspective, compares it to the national average and to some other specific states. And these are the 12 species that are included in the noxious weed law. So you see these thistles: Canada thistle, musk thistle, common teasel, Scotch thistle, cutleaf teasel, Johnson grass, spotted knapweed, multiflora rose, purple loosestrife, marijuana, field bindweed, and kudzu. So those are the 12 currently on the Missouri Noxious Weed Law. Our cease-the-sale proposal would be completely separate from Missouri's Noxious Weed Law. The cease-the-sale statute, as we're envisioning it, would prohibit only the sale, propagation, and intentional distribution of a select list of known invasive plants. And property owners would not be penalized for presence of invasive plants on their property, They would not be required to treat or remove those invasive plants. Our proposed statute would be complementary to, not a replacement or alteration of, the Missouri Noxious Weed Law. Our proposed cease-the-sale statute would also authorize funding and regulatory authority to the appropriate state agency or other entity to manage the statute. The restrictions, as we propose them, would be that a person may not intentionally propagate, import, transfer, sell, purchase, or introduce any viable part of an invasive plant in Missouri. These restrictions would not apply to the transfer, lease, sale, or purchase of real property on which an invasive plant is already established. There are other cease-the-sale kinds of regulations in other states. They've been adopted in Ohio, Indiana, and Maryland. So we've proposed this. We're having this webinar today to inform interested parties about what we're proposing. And we wonder, what will stakeholders in Missouri think about this? Our intent is to be fully transparent, and that's why we're having this webinar. And that's also why we are seeking stakeholder input. So this fall, very, very soon, MoIP will be inviting more than 90 stakeholder groups from agriculture, horticulture, conservation, and regional planning sectors in Missouri to review our list of 142 invasive plants and provide input on which of them they would support adding to a cease-the-sale list. Matt developed this wonderful tool that we will be inviting stakeholder groups to use. On the left, this is a screenshot, but on the left, they would see the whole list of 142 species. So in this example, suppose they click on bush honeysuckle here, then they would get this screen here. You see bush honeysuckle at the top. They can read about it from the USDA plant species profile, and then they can indicate their organization's position regarding inclusion of this species in the Cease-the-Sale initiative. They could click if they highly support ceasing the sale of it, they slightly support, they're neutral, they slightly oppose, they highly oppose ceasing the sale, or they're not familiar with this species. And then we ask them to justify their selection. They can submit, and then they can continue with another species. Now, we want to point out that not all of those 142 plant species are readily available to purchase. Only a subset of them is widely available, but nearly any of them could be purchased via the internet. But to help people understand that there is a subset of plants that are readily available, we've created a short list, which will be part of the information that we send out to stakeholder groups. So we created a short list, which is Callery pear, common periwinkle, heavenly bamboo, Japanese zelkova, Japanese plume grass, winged burning bush, sweet autumn, virgin spower, English ivy, winter creeper, tall fescue, European wan loosestrife, water hyacinth, Japanese barberry, fountain grass, golden bamboo, lacebark or Chinese elm, and purple loosestrife. So we're creating this short list, but we are asking for feedback on all 142 species. Now, we also wanted to point out that there are invasive plants, such as bush honeysuckle, that are not included on that short list because they're not currently popular and they're not readily available from the horticulture market, but they are on our ranked assessment of 142 species, and we're asking stakeholder groups to provide input on them. We just think it's safer to include plants that we know have varying degrees of invasiveness, even if they're not commonly sold now, in case they might become available for sale in the future. We also have plants, invasive plants with high agricultural value, such as tall fescue. That's widely used. It's a significant forage for livestock. It's on our list of 142 species. But we do realize that they are economically significant to some stakeholders, and they may not want them included on the cease-the-sale list. And they can certainly indicate that with that tool that I just showed you that Matt developed. Following the stakeholder organizational input, the stakeholder group input, we're going to invite individuals and businesses who are likely to feel a direct financial impact from a potential cease-the-sale statute, such as plant nurseries or farmers. We're inviting them to provide input on the expected level of benefit or harm that they would expect following passage of the statute under a series of hypothetical enforcement timelines. So our goal here is to determine if a phase out period should be included for certain species and how long that period should be. This is to allow affected businesses an opportunity to sell their existing stock of cease-the-sale species in order to minimize economic hardship that might be created by the statute. We will also ask these or invite these individuals and businesses to indicate the percentage of their income and expenditures that are dedicated to species on the cease-the-sale list. So here's an example of what a questionnaire to business owners might look like. So here, I don't know if you, hopefully you can read this, but here's calorie pair as an example. And we are inviting people to rate the following statements by selecting from these options. The immediate cessation of the sale or distribution of calorie pair, it would very negatively affect their business, somewhat negatively affect, neither positively nor negatively affect, somewhat positively affect, very positively affect. And then other questions about implementation of a 5-year phase-in, a 10-year full exemption from the initiative, and then what approximate percentage of their gross business income is derived from the species. So to summarize, MoIP developed a ranked assessment of 142 plants known to be invasive. It's available at moinvasives.org. We're proposing a cease-the-sale statute to stop the sale and intentional distribution of a list of plants known to be invasive. It would be completely separate from the Missouri Noxious Weed Law. We're inviting stakeholder groups to provide input on which of these 142 species they would support, including in a cease-the-sale statute list of plants. Information that we'll send to stakeholder groups will include a short list of invasive plants that are most readily available for sale, even though virtually any 142 could be obtained through, internet commerce. After we receive that stakeholder group input, we'll invite businesses and groups to provide input on the expected level of benefit or harm they would expect following passage of the statute under a series of hypothetical enforcement timelines. And then from these 2 tiers of input, we'll develop the list of plants to be included in the proposed statute. So at this time, I think Matt's gonna to step in, and if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and we will do our best to answer them. I don't think I see any questions right now.
There are a few questions, Carol, already.
Oh, I must not be looking at the right, in my chat box, I'm not seeing anything there.
In the Q&A box instead of the chat box.
Gotcha.
I'll address the first few. One that's already been answered. The question was, will the slides be available later? Yes, they will. The full recording and the slides will be available later. Another question regarding highway departments. That was posted back with the list of members and stakeholder organizations for MoIP. MoDOT was, or it had been a member of MoIP. If I remember correctly, it's been a year or two. They withdrew due to budgetary constraints. They weren't able to participate any longer. MoDOT had been a member, but they're not anymore. Moving down, how does our list of 142 match with MDC's assessment? Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe MDC actually adopted our list of 142 species as their list of invasive species. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, once we developed that list, MDC then adopted it as their official list. I do see some other questions too. There was a question on Facebook. Thanks, Tina, for posting it. Would there be incentives for property owners who wish to remove invasives? We certainly advocate for people controlling invasive species on their properties. Our cease-the-sale statute pertains exclusively to the sale and intentional distribution. It doesn't include any incentives for removal of species, although we certainly support that. Matt, would you care to comment any more on that?
I'm sorry, I was taking notes from another question.
Okay, just that again, our cease the sale proposed statute is just that. It's proposal to cease the sale and intentional distribution of invasive plants, and it does not have any kind of measures for removal of plants on property. But we certainly advocate for increased resources to help private landowners control invasive plants. And there are, if you're not aware, there are federal cost share programs and state cost share programs now that provide assistance for private landowners to control and treat invasive plants. And Matt has experience with that and might want to comment on that further.
Yeah, backing up just a little bit. Yes, you're accurate that we don't have intention at this point to include any sort of a mandated control effort. There's some of these species that are just too far spread to, if we say that it's going to be actively enforced, that a penalty for existence or mandated control, this is going to be a non-starter from the beginning. As far as control efforts and state and federal cost share, those programs are out there, they're active. Whether they have enough money to fund everything is always a question. The federal side through NRCS, EQIP program always has more funding than state private land cost share through the LAP docket through MDC. If anybody's interested in that aspect, the control and cost share funding, I would encourage you to contact your local private lands conservationist, and they can help steer you in the right direction for those.
Thanks, Matt. There's a question here: how do you get the Home Depot, Lowe's, Menards on board? And I would say that if this state statute passes, then it would be applicable to any plant seller in Missouri. So it would pertain to, any entity that is selling plants. And Matt, jump in here too if you want to comment on any of these or elaborate on anything I might address. There's another question pertaining to business owners. Will you also ask on the questionnaire what the total revenue of each stakeholder is so the percentage impact can be put in perspective? That's an interesting question. I mean, we will, the percent, but I think, go ahead.
That was the one that I was writing down in my notes.
Oh, okay.
So I would say that, that's certainly worth considering. Just off the top of my head, I would expect that fewer people would be willing to tell us what their total revenue is than would be willing to tell us what percentage revenue comes from these species. So that was the reason that I included the percent as opposed to any sort of a total dollar amount to begin with. But I certainly do think that it's worth considering.
Thanks, Matt. There's a couple of questions here that are similar. And I think I'll read both of them, and then I'll answer, and then Matt may want to answer as well. Seems like some businesses will be hesitant to lose revenue for not being able to sell some of these invasive plants. In the assessment tool, are you providing recommendations for native plants that would be good replacements, or would you consider it? And then someone else asked a similar question: is there an educational component for retailers and wholesalers, including big box stores? So the answer is yes. We do provide educational content to retailers about native plants that could be sold instead of invasive plants. We have information on our Grow Native website. We have information on our Mo Invasive site. And we have conducted outreach to suppliers of large retailers, specifically about calorie pair, asking them, just letting them know who we were, and making them aware of the invasive nature of calorie pair, because some simply don't know. And then providing native alternatives, because we want people to we do not want people's revenue to be negatively affected by this. And we feel that there are many native alternatives, or even non-native, non-invasive alternatives. And we do intend to do even more of that outreach. As far as including that information into the statute language, I'm not sure if we would do that, but we definitely want to make everyone aware that we have suggestions for replacement, alternatives of native species, or even they could even be non-native but non-invasive species. Anything else you'd like to comment further on that, Matt?
Yeah, that was a topic that we discussed directly as we've been working on this, and just the direction that we intend to go at this point, at least that we had settled on in the interim, was direct people to the existing grow native recommendations, and as far as the specific species recommendations for replacements, utilize those that already exist within grow native, but also make sure that people are aware that there are non-invasive, non-native options also. So instead of trying to come up with an exhaustive list of every native or non-native plant that is an adequate replacement, we were going to focus on utilizing the existing grow native resources and make sure that people are aware that there's a lot of non-native plants there also. I see a couple questions regarding how much opposition, pushback, and who do we most expect that to come from. Yes, there certainly will be some level of opposition. It doesn't matter what sort of effort it is, there will always be some sort of opposition. Where I at least am anticipating the most opposition is from those sectors that directly utilize the plants that we're proposing. Hopefully, with the options either for, in very limited circumstances, a full exemption, or a phase-in period for the nursery type, plant nursery type businesses, that will mitigate an awful lot of that opposition, and people will be more so on board knowing that they have a chance to liquidate their existing stock of some of these, and they don't have to destroy whole fields of plants.
Yeah, again, like to echo what Matt said, that's why we have really put a lot of thought into this and are really actively seeking stakeholder group input, because that's just, we feel like that's the right thing to do. Is we want to be transparent. We don't want there to be any surprises. We want people to have the opportunity to have input. And there was a related question there, I thought. Let's see here. Well, I think maybe we did answer that, but there are some other questions here too, about groups that might want to be involved and be able to provide input. And so if you are interested, let us know what group you belong to. It's very possible that your group is already on our list. So you can send an email to info@moprairie.org. That's one way to reach us, and we can, and there's also email address on the MoIP website as well. And there are some other questions here regarding invasive plants that are already on the landscape. And yes, that's a very difficult question, and that is something that we are working to address. That's another goal of MoIP, is to really elevate or prioritize comprehensive statewide early detection and control of invasive plants. And the first step was to create this assessment so that we even know what we're dealing with, and to be able to rank them those ways that we did. there was a question, I think, instead of having the list in alphabetical order, how about having them in order of, worst to least impactful? And we are, now that we have that assessment, we are working with it to create some sort of subset lists. I hesitate to say the worst offenders because, again, it's important to look at these things regionally, because what can be invasive in one part of the state is not so in another part. However, there are some that do rise to the surface, and Matt has been working on that. Matt, would you like to talk a bit more about creating sort of sub lists and how, from the assessment, and how that will help with prioritizing control?
Yeah, and speaking directly to the idea of a worse invasive species, you get into, is a species worse because it has more impact when it exists, or because it exists in far more parts of the state, or because it's one that's very, very destructive and costly in the boot heel, but doesn't exist in the rest of the state. So there was a subcommittee that worked directly on that question, and we did develop different criteria. We have several different types of worst invasive species lists. Right now, there's another subcommittee working on how do we present those, how do we use those. So hopefully those will be publicly available sooner rather than later. But as it stands right now, there isn't a way to directly rank those by worst, and I doubt that there will be a way to rank the full 142. But we do have in the works, at the very least, top 10 lists broken down by region and statewide, and several different criteria.
Thanks, Matt. And I just wanted to reiterate, just in case there's any confusion. Again, there is no, MoIP has no jurisdiction over this. And this list of 142 species, this is just science. It's just fact that there are 142 species on our list with some known level of invasiveness. It's from that list that we're inviting people, to these different stakeholder groups, to provide input. Which of those would they support, including on an eventual list that would be part of the statute? So there's a question here. Is there any way to know if local nurseries are complying with MoIP? So we are not a regulatory group. We have no authority in this. There is no cease-the-sale list now. Okay, I just want to make that clear. What we're proposing is that we're inviting stakeholder groups to look at our list of 142 species known to be invasive, to look at that and indicate which of those they would support, including on a list that would be part of a state statute. So I just wanted to make that clear in case there was any confusion. So, and someone had a question here. What about online sellers from out of state? Will we be able to make sure that no shipments from out of state bring invasives in? And Matt, I believe that anybody who's selling plants within a state, even if they're outside of a state, they have to be licensed to sell plants. And so part of that is making people aware of what each state's rules are. And so that is how they would find out. So if this statute passed, then that information would be made known to plant sellers.
I think there has to be a level of realism with that whatever the enforcement component of this eventually looks like, it's not going to be 100% universally effective. And I mean, it's the same as a speed limit. You know, the speed limit on the interstate 70 miles an hour, and it keeps people reasonably within check. So trying to think that speed limit stops every single person from driving over 70, I think is unrealistic. And I would say that would be the same as enforcement of this. If we can accomplish the vast majority of these species not being sold, then that's a whole lot better than where we're at now. Obviously, it would be best if we could have 100% compliance, voluntary compliance, and wouldn't need any enforcement. That would be the best option, but that's hasn't happened. So we don't know yet exactly what that enforcement will look like. But yes, one thing that I would anticipate is there was another question about municipalities notifying their local plant sellers and nurseries of this if and when it goes into effect. I would expect that there would be some sort of a mailing from based on the licensing. Every grower or seller that has a license would get a notification in the state, and hopefully that would cover everybody. There was another question or a comment more so about the going back to the example of the follow-up survey that Carol showed earlier, that the 10-year phase-in for calorie pair might be way too long. That was the 5 and 10-year options on there were just an example. We've actually, one of the members of MoIP is working on nursery times required for different species to grow, so that we can hopefully refine those proposed phase-in periods. I believe it was Indiana, their statute that they passed a couple years ago allowed a blanket 1-year phase-in. Basically, it gave the growers the option to sell their existing stock now, or they would have to destroy it. So looking at there are several options for what that phase-in could look like.
Thanks, Matt. There's some questions that people there's some favorable comments about our proposed approach and how they can be involved. And I would say that, once we, and what our approach is, so we do want to be identifying potential co-sponsors of this legislation. And so that's an upcoming step that's coming up. And if we are successful at getting this introduced, then it would be wonderful if you, let your elected officials know that that you support it. As far as it would be up to that would be part of the statute of the legislator deciding on the agency or the entity that would enforce this. We definitely advocate and propose in our statute that whatever entity would be asked to regulate an eventual statute, that they have the resources that they would need in order to manage it.
There's another question on what if a plant breeder releases a known sterile version of a plant on the short list, or the short list is just a short attention getter type of list. So a known sterile version of a plant on the Cease-the-Sale initiative. That would be the same as any variety of calorie pair. The Bradford cultivar, the Chanticleer cultivar, the Cleveland Select, those are all sterile versions of calorie pair. But when those are placed on the landscape next to each other, they're able to cross-pollinate. So the way we are planning to address this is every species that's listed is a blanket listing for the entire species. There won't be any exempted cultivars, there won't be any exempted subspecies, varieties, etc. It's a blanket listing for the entire species.
Thanks, Matt. There's a question about, is there a movement such as this happening in more states that border Missouri, like Illinois? And I don't know, Matt, Illinois does have, they have, I think they're called, not weed districts, but they have regional groups that work with many partners on identification and control issues. But in terms of a state legislation about sale, I'm not sure. Are you familiar, Matt, of any states surrounding Missouri?
No, but that's one thing that we've an idea that's been brought up is to expand, and this will actually speak to several of the other questions about how to update this list long term. With the current assessment system, it was an Excel-based survey and manual compilation. I've worked on moving that over to a web-based system that can be continually updated, and then looking at potentially expanding it to, at the very least, the states surrounding Missouri, if not the entire Midwest, or who knows, the whole country. By doing that, the benefits, number one, you get continual updates. You have the option at least for continual feedback. So as new species are emerging, are released, escape, what have you, there's the potential to get those included in the assessment and get information on them. And then if we can get it expanded to a more of a regional scale, we may be able to see something coming if there's a species that's moving geographically. Then if it becomes a problem in Iowa, but we don't have it on our list, we know that we need to be looking for it. The same for Illinois, for Arkansas, for any of the surrounding states. As far as what specifically it will look like on how to add or subtract a species from this list once it's passed into law, we don't have that a proposal for that process nailed down just yet. That is, we do expect to, before we get too terribly far through this process, to have a recommendation for how to add species or how to remove species if necessary from that final list.
Thanks, Matt. And Tina, who does contract work for us, she reminded me that we did look at other states' noxious weed lists, including surrounding states, when developing our list of 142. There was a question about that bioscience article from the information you gleaned, Matt, that there were 391 species that they considered noxious in Missouri. That's their terminology, whereas our assessment has 142.
I believe that includes native nuisance species also.
Oh, okay, that's 391. Okay,
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to really state our definitions up front. So our 140, we're looking only at, so our definition of invasive are aggressive non-native species. And so that's where that study had a different definition. There were a couple of questions here about climate change and shifting plant geographies. And I think Matt addressed that to some degree when he was talking about updating the lists. Yeah, nothing in nature is static, and there's nothing static about non-native invasive species as well. Yeah, things are constantly changing, and shifting climate is probably making some species now. I mean, we have evidence now of certain invasive plants spreading more rapidly than they were several years ago. Maybe other spread of other species might contract. That's an unknown. But yes, we do have a system that we're working on to have more constant update of the list. And certainly climate change is another factor.
One of those questions, Carol, I know specifically addressed native species moving with respect to climate change, and as of right now, this effort is only focused on invasive species. Those native nuisance species are not included.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And Isabel had a question again about that it might be helpful as people are using the stakeholder input tool, that it might be helpful for them to see alternative species. And yeah, we want it, that's a really good thought. We do want to make the tools like really clear because there's so much information, but maybe there's a way that we can provide that information in kind of the introductory material. That's a really good point. It would be good for us to incorporate that in some way when we're seeking stakeholder group input. Let's see, hoping I haven't missed any questions here.
There was one question, what individual species do we expect the most opposition? My perspective on that from the agricultural sector, specifically cattle folks, the range cattlemen's association or the grazing community would be tall fescue and smooth brome. Those are important agricultural plants from a grassland forage perspective. And then on the horticulture side, I would expect the burning bush, Japanese barberry, the most commonly sold and planted species. Japanese Zelkova is becoming more and more common. Calorie pear, I think, has lost favor among a lot of homeowners and landscapers, so I don't expect it will be as contentious. But those highly contentious and polarizing species are the ones that we expect we'll have to look at some sort of either a blanket exemption or a phase-in period, something along those lines to make it more palatable. And in an ideal world, we'd be able to find a solution that is satisfactory to everybody. But the reality is that just likely isn't going to happen.
But that's why we do want the input, because we respect that a number of user groups, certain plants are very important, especially for forage, and that's why we're seeking the input, so we can see what kind of a list we end up with. There's a question about certain lists, stakeholders. So again, the stakeholder lists include many agriculture groups, many conservation and outdoor recreation groups, planning groups, and horticulture groups. And there's a question, are we working with a state representative at this time? We think that there are several state representatives who are elected officials interested in this. And as soon as we can finalize some sort of basic bill language, we will present that. And then once we go through the stakeholder input process, we will add the suggested, subset of plants to that bill language.
The bottom question there, if there's plans to add more species to the noxious plant list, for control by the noxious weed law, as it stands right now, no. This is a completely separate effort. I've seen that question and discussion brought up through a few different groups that I'm a part of, and the ending answer is just about universally, it's likely not going to happen. It would be very, very difficult to get a plant added to the noxious weed law, and the reason being that there is that requirement to control. So if a new plant were added, that would automatically put, if it's a new widespread plant, that would automatically put a huge number of landowners in violation of the noxious weed law. So I think that there's very little appetite to expand that list at this point.
Yeah, and then just to follow up, MoIP certainly isn't exploring that. I mean, there might be other groups exploring that, but I'm not aware of any. And it sounds like Matt's not aware of it.
It's been discussed, but nobody's making an active effort to do so.
Okay. Well, it is almost 5 o'clock. And Matt, did you want to add in? I think we addressed just about all the questions. Matt, did you have anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I know we didn't address every single question specifically, but I hope we at least captured the intent of all of them. Yeah, there were a few I don't know that we've addressed. A few questions were, what can people do to help? At this point, where we're at in this stage is we just need to get a little bit farther in the process. Once this effort makes it to the legislature, the thing to do to help would be to call your given rep and voice your opinion, pro or con.
Thanks, Matt. And again, if you have other questions, please do contact us. You can go to moinvasives.org and send us a message and check out the assessment. We love having suggestions, and I've learned a lot from the input that everybody has provided today. And so please stay tuned. We will have updated information on our website. And I want to thank Tina Casagrande for answering some questions in the chat and providing some information, and also Felicia for setting up the technology for today's webinar. And it is recorded, and you can review it later as well. And we also have a whole lineup of more webinars and master classes all the way through to December. We have one next week, a master class with Scott Woodbury on landscaping with native asters and goldenrods. And you can find all that information at grownative.org. So thanks again. Thank you so much, Matt. And thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.